In the hierarchy of American organized crime, Harlem was never meant to challenge the Italian Mafia. That belief shaped how power moved through New York for decades. Harlem was considered territory to influence, exploit, or pressure, but never to negotiate with. By the late 1930s, however, that assumption began to crack. What unfolded next would force even the most powerful mob bosses to reconsider how control truly worked. The Italian Mafia had long relied on a reputation built through intimidation. Guns were not just weapons, they were symbols. When armed men appeared, it was meant to end discussion before it began. Harlem had seen violence before, but this moment carried a different weight. This was not street-level enforcement. This was organized power, making a statement. Lucky Luciano's men did not arrive by accident. Their presence was calculated, timed to coincide with a shift in Harlem's economic influence. Harlem was generating money, structure, and stability outside traditional mafia channels. That autonomy posed a problem. Power that cannot be controlled becomes a threat. The guns were not drawn for chaos. They were displayed for clarity. The message was simple. Dominance still belonged to the mob. Harlem was expected to remember its place. In their worldview, resistance was irrational and negotiation unnecessary. What they underestimated was the man standing at the center of Harlem's ecosystem. He was not impulsive. He did not react to intimidation the way others did. Years of navigating pressure had shaped how he responded to threats. Loud force did not impress him. It revealed desperation. The presence of armed mob associates sent ripples through Harlem, but not panic. Harlem was accustomed to pressure. What made this moment different was who applied it. This was not a local dispute. This was a declaration from the highest level of organized crime in America. The streets noticed the shift immediately. Businesses paused. Movement slowed. Silence replaced speculation. Harlem understood that this was a test, not of strength, but of response. How this moment was handled would define future boundaries. The mob believed the situation was already decided. Guns had always ended conversations before. They expected retreat, submission, or reckless defiance, any outcome that confirmed their superiority. What they did not expect was restraint. No immediate confrontation followed, no escalation, no visible fear. That absence unsettled expectations. When intimidation fails to provoke reaction, it loses effectiveness. Control depends on predictability. This moment offered none. The men with guns were waiting for something to break, for someone to flinch, for tension to spill into violence. Instead, Harlem absorbed the pressure quietly. The lack of response introduced uncertainty into a situation built on dominance. This was the first mistake. The mob assumed that force alone determined outcomes. They failed to recognize that power also depends on perception, and perception had begun shifting. Harlem was not challenging the mafia openly. It was doing something far more dangerous. It was refusing to react on command. That refusal created space for recalculation, for strategy, for leverage. The guns remained present, but their meaning changed. What was intended as a show of authority began to resemble exposure. Exposure of limits. Exposure of misjudgment. The mob had drawn a line. What they did not yet realize was that Harlem had already crossed into a different kind of territory, one where patience outweighed firepower. And as the armed men waited for submission that never came, the balance of the situation quietly began to shift. What the mob believed was a final warning was only the beginning of a confrontation that would not be settled with weapons but with something far more destabilizing to organized power. Intimidation works best when the target believes resistance is futile. For decades, the mafia relied on this principle without challenge. Fear was efficient. It eliminated negotiation, discouraged defiance, and preserved hierarchy. But fear depends on certainty, and certainty was absent in Harlem. The men sent to enforce dominance expected fear to move faster than strategy. Instead, strategy moved quietly beneath the surface. Harlem did not react emotionally. It observed. Observation is dangerous when force expects obedience. The difference lay in how power was structured. Harlem's influence was not centralized around violence. It was distributed through relationships, economics, and mutual dependence. Disrupting that structure required more than threats. It required understanding. And understanding was precisely what the mob lacked. The presence of guns signaled urgency, not confidence. It revealed that traditional pressure had failed to produce compliance. The mob had escalated too quickly, exposing impatience. In organized power, impatience is vulnerability. Harlem's leadership understood this instinctively. Escalation without negotiation often indicates a loss of control. The guns were meant to close the situation. Instead, they opened questions. Why now? Why force? Why visibility? Each question weakened the message the mob intended to send. Harlem's response was not defiance, it was continuity. Business continued. Structure remained intact. Influence did not fracture. The absence of disruption undermined the threat. When nothing changes, intimidation loses credibility. The streets began interpreting the situation differently. This was no longer about fear. It was about leverage. Harlem recognized that the mob needed compliance more than Harlem needed protection. That realization altered the dynamic entirely. The Mafia had always dominated environments where fragmentation existed. Chaos made enforcement easy. Harlem was not chaotic. It was organized, disciplined, and interconnected. Applying pressure without understanding that structure risked backfire. The armed men became observers rather than enforcers. Their presence no longer commanded response. It invited evaluation. And evaluation stripped the moment of its intended finality. What truly unsettled the mob was the lack of urgency. No meetings rushed, no frantic adjustments. Harlem moved deliberately, as if time favored them. Time is power when force loses momentum. Behind the scenes, calculations were being made. Not about confrontation, but about consequences. Violence would bring attention. Attention would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny threatened long-term operations on both sides. The mob began realizing that escalation carried risk beyond immediate dominance. Harlem's restraint forced reconsideration. Guns could start wars, but they could not guarantee victory without cost. This was not the outcome the mob anticipated. Their approach assumed hierarchy was fixed. Harlem demonstrated that hierarchy could be negotiated through discipline rather than fear. The guns had failed to end the conversation. Worse, they had initiated one Harlem was prepared to control. Power had shifted from physical threat to strategic positioning. That shift is rarely visible in the moment, but its effects are lasting. The mob now faced a choice: escalate further and risk instability, or step back and reassess an opponent who refused to behave as expected. This pause, this hesitation marked the first real loss of dominance. As the mob reconsidered its next move, Harlem prepared a response that required no weapons at all, one that would force even the most feared crime boss in America to stand down. The moment intimidation failed, the balance of power entered unfamiliar territory. Organized crime depended on predictable reactions. Fear was expected to produce compliance, panic, or reckless defiance. Harlem offered none of it. That absence was not accidental, it was cultivated. Harlem's leadership understood something the mob often overlooked. Power does not always need to be demonstrated. Sometimes, it only needs to be positioned. While the armed men waited for a reaction, Harlem focused on preservation. Stability became the response. Continuity became the message. Businesses continued operating. Money kept moving. Relationships remained intact. There were no visible fractures for the mob to exploit. This continuity signaled confidence, not denial. Harlem was communicating that it was not operating under threat, even when weapons were present. This approach reframed the entire confrontation. The mob's presence was meant to create urgency. Harlem removed it. Without urgency, intimidation loses tempo. And without tempo, force becomes expensive. Behind the scenes, Harlem's network assessed the broader consequences. Escalation would not be decided emotionally. It would be measured against risk. Violence invited attention. Attention invited law enforcement scrutiny. Scrutiny threatened operations on both sides. Harlem understood that the mob was vulnerable to exposure in ways street organizations often were not. The guns had created a paradox. They were meant to assert dominance, but they also increased visibility. Visibility weakened discretion. Discretion was the foundation of long-term control. Harlem began leveraging this imbalance quietly. Influence was not exercised through threats, but through access. Access to markets, access to cooperation, access to silence. These were assets guns could not secure without consent. The mob relied on compliance to maintain smooth operations. Harlem's refusal to comply did not disrupt immediately, but it introduced friction. Friction slowed movement. Slowed movement invited oversight. Oversight created risk. Patience became a weapon. While the mob waited for fear to take hold, Harlem waited for the cost of escalation to become clear. Every hour that passed without submission weakened the original message. What began as a show of strength started resembling a miscalculation. This strategy did not require confrontation. It required discipline. Harlem's leadership avoided visible response precisely because visibility would validate the threat. By denying that validation, the threat lost momentum. The streets noticed the shift. Conversations changed tone. The presence of guns no longer dominated discussion. Instead, people questioned why they had appeared at all. Questioning undermined authority. Authority depends on certainty, not curiosity. The mob now faced an uncomfortable reality. Escalating further would confirm loss of control. Retreating openly would damage reputation. Either option carried consequence. Harlem's restraint had created a strategic dilemma. This was the moment where leverage replaced force. Harlem had not challenged dominance directly. It had made dominance inefficient. And inefficiency is unacceptable in organized power structures. What the mob had intended as a swift demonstration had turned into a prolonged exposure. Time favored the side that could endure without reacting. Harlem had chosen endurance. As patience reshaped the confrontation, the mob was forced to consider a step it rarely took, engaging not with guns, but with calculation that acknowledged resistance without admitting defeat. When force fails, organized power turns to negotiation quietly, indirectly, and without admitting necessity. The mob reached this stage reluctantly. The presence of guns had not produced compliance. Instead, it had stalled momentum and introduced uncertainty. That uncertainty demanded reassessment. The shift did not happen publicly. There was no announcement, no withdrawal, no visible concession. The change appeared through silence. Armed men became less visible. Pressure softened. The environment adjusted subtly, as if recalibrating without acknowledgement. This adjustment was not generosity. It was calculation. The mob understood that prolonged confrontation threatened its broader interests. Harlem was not isolated. It was connected economically and socially in ways that made disruption costly. Any escalation risked attention that could not be controlled once triggered. Harlem recognized the shift immediately. Reduced visibility signaled reconsideration. Reconsideration signaled leverage. The confrontation had moved from intimidation to evaluation. That transition marked a critical turning point. The mob began weighing outcomes rather than dominance. Could escalation succeed without damaging long-term operations? Could submission be extracted without appearing weak? Neither option offered clean resolution. Harlem's strategy had forced this dilemma intentionally. By refusing to react emotionally, it compelled the mob to confront consequences rather than rely on habit. Habit is comfortable, consequence is not. What unsettled the mob most was the realization that Harlem was not seeking confrontation at all. It was seeking equilibrium. Equilibrium removes justification for violence. Violence without justification invites scrutiny. This understanding altered how the mob approached the situation. Pressure was replaced with distance. Distance allowed time. Time allowed recalculation. The confrontation was no longer about who could impose will, but who could afford disruption. The guns that once symbolized authority now symbolized risk. Their presence no longer projected inevitability. It projected exposure. Exposure is dangerous for organizations built on discretion. Harlem's leadership understood that the moment required restraint. not triumph. Public victory would provoke retaliation. Quiet resolution would preserve influence. The goal was not to defeat the mob, but to force acknowledgement of limits. Acknowledgement is power. The mob began exploring alternatives that preserved reputation without escalation. That exploration alone signaled retreat, even if unspoken. Retreat does not always involve movement away. Sometimes it involves choosing not to advance. Harlem's response remained consistent. No celebration, no escalation. Stability continued. This consistency reinforced leverage. It demonstrated that Harlem did not need immediate resolution to maintain control. The confrontation had reached its most dangerous phase not because violence was imminent, but because miscalculation could undo everything. Both sides understood that the next move would define future boundaries. This was no longer a test of strength. It was a test of judgment. The mob's leadership faced a decision rarely encountered: stand firm and risk instability, or step back and preserve long-term control by conceding space without admitting defeat. The choice would reveal how far intimidation could go before encountering resistance it could not overcome. As the mob weighed its options, one final calculation remained: whether acknowledging Harlem's autonomy would weaken authority more than continuing a confrontation that had already begun to unravel. At a certain level of organized power, violence stops being the most effective weapon. Reputation replaces it. Fear gives way to calculation. By this stage of the confrontation, the mob had begun to realize that guns alone could not resolve what they had started. The presence of weapons had failed to secure compliance. What remained was the risk of damaging something far more valuable than dominance: credibility. For decades, the Mafia's authority rested on the belief that resistance was futile. That belief was as important as enforcement itself. Once resistance appeared and survived, the entire structure faced scrutiny. Harlem had not confronted the mob directly, but it had exposed a limitation. That exposure carried consequences far beyond this single conflict. The mob's leadership understood that reputation operated on perception. If intimidation could be ignored in one territory, it could be tested in others. Power depended on the assumption of inevitability. Harlem had disrupted that assumption without firing a single shot. This realization reframed the confrontation completely. The issue was no longer Harlem's compliance. It was containment. The mob needed to ensure that this moment did not redefine how others perceived its reach. Escalation risked attention. Retreat risked precedent. Either choice threatened reputation. Harlem's leadership recognized the shift instantly. Pressure was no longer aggressive. It was cautious. Movements became indirect. Signals were subtle. The confrontation had entered a psychological phase where every action carried symbolic weight. The streets sensed it as well. Conversations changed. The focus moved away from weapons and toward outcomes. People began asking not who had more firepower, but who controlled the situation. Control was no longer measured by intimidation. It was measured by restraint. The mob now faced a dilemma it could not solve through habit. Violence would invite law enforcement scrutiny at a scale that endangered broader operations. Silence would suggest limitation. Negotiation risked acknowledgement of autonomy. Harlem's strategy relied on this tension. It did not seek to embarrass the mob. Embarrassment provokes retaliation. Instead, it allowed the mob to confront its own constraints. Constraints are harder to deny than threats. Behind closed doors, calculations intensified. The cost of escalation was weighed against the cost of concession. The conclusion became unavoidable. Forcing compliance in Harlem would require more than intimidation. It would require sustained exposure. Exposure was unacceptable. The mob began to recognize that preserving long-term authority required sacrificing short-term dominance. This was not weakness. It was survival. Organized power evolves by choosing where not to fight. Harlem's restraint made this evolution necessary. The city had not challenged authority directly. It had demonstrated endurance. Endurance undermines intimidation by outlasting it. What made this moment critical was its visibility within criminal networks. Even unspoken, shifts in behavior are noticed. Reduced pressure signals recalibration. Recalibration signals acknowledgement. The mob's authority was no longer absolute in this context. It was conditional. Conditional authority requires careful management. Guns could enforce compliance temporarily, but they could not restore certainty once doubt existed. This realization placed the mob's leadership in unfamiliar territory. They were no longer dictating terms. They were managing risk. The confrontation had reached a point where reputation itself was at stake. As the mob weighed the cost of preserving its image, one final decision remained: whether maintaining authority required pushing further or stepping back before exposure became irreversible. Standing down does not always look like retreat. At the highest levels of organized crime, it often appears as restraint, a choice not to escalate, a decision to redirect focus elsewhere. That is how power preserves itself when force no longer guarantees control. The mob boss, at the center of this confrontation, understood the implications clearly. Continuing pressure in Harlem risked transforming a contained dispute into a symbolic loss. Symbols travel, they influence behavior beyond their origin. Allowing this moment to escalate threatened to redefine boundaries far larger than Harlem itself. The decision to stand down was not announced. It did not require public acknowledgement. It unfolded through absence. Pressure eased. Armed presence faded. The confrontation dissolved without ceremony. This absence spoke louder than escalation ever could. It signaled acceptance without admission. The mob was choosing preservation over dominance. Harlem recognized the shift immediately. Reduced visibility confirmed the outcome. The threat had passed not because force had been defeated, but because its use had become impractical. This moment marked a rare recalibration. The mob had not lost control entirely, but it had acknowledged a limit. Acknowledgement is the most dangerous outcome for any power structure built on inevitability. The city absorbed the change quietly. There was no celebration, no claim of victory. Claiming victory would have invited response. Silence preserved balance. Balance preserved influence. For Harlem, this outcome reinforced a critical lesson. Power does not always need confrontation to assert itself. Sometimes, survival itself is leverage. By enduring pressure without reacting, Harlem had forced reconsideration at the highest level. The mob boss redirected attention elsewhere. Other territories offered easier compliance, easier dominance. Harlem was no longer worth the cost. This decision protected long-term operations. It maintained broader authority. But it left behind an unspoken precedent. Harlem had resisted intimidation and remained intact. That fact could not be erased. Within criminal networks, moments like this are remembered even when they are not discussed. Behavior adjusts accordingly. Authority becomes more selective. Pressure is applied with greater calculation. The confrontation had ended, but its implications endured. Harlem was no longer assumed to be a space where intimidation alone guaranteed submission. That change altered future interactions. The mob boss's decision to stand down did not weaken his empire. It preserved it. But preservation required acknowledging that force has limits. For Harlem, this acknowledgement reshaped how power moved. It did not eliminate threats. It redefined responses. Patience became strategy. Restraint became defense. The absence of violence was not a failure of authority. It was an evolution of it. Organized power survives by adapting, not by insisting on outdated methods. This moment would never appear in official histories. There were no records documenting restraint. But within the underworld, its meaning was understood. The guns had been brought to Harlem. They had failed to end the conversation, and when the moment arrived to choose between dominance and survival, survival prevailed. The mob boss stood down. What neither side could yet see was how this quiet standoff would reshape future encounters, proving that the most decisive victories are often the ones no one publicly claims. Power structures rarely announce when they change. They adapt quietly, absorbing lessons without acknowledgement. After the mob's decision to stand down, there was no public recognition of what had occurred, no declarations, no formal shifts in territory. Yet, beneath the surface, the underworld began adjusting its assumptions. Harlem was no longer viewed as a space where intimidation alone guaranteed submission. That change did not spread through headlines or meetings. It traveled through behavior, through caution, through hesitation. Organized power does not need confirmation to recognize altered terrain. The absence of escalation sent a signal that could not be ignored. Guns had failed to force compliance. Escalation had been deemed too costly. That outcome redefined how influence was measured. Force was no longer sufficient on its own. Strategy, patience, and endurance had proven equally powerful. Other organizations took notice, not openly, but instinctively. Pressure tactics became more calculated. Territories were evaluated differently. Harlem was approached with greater restraint. The cost of misjudgment had been exposed. This recalibration did not weaken organized crime. It refined it. Power that survives learns when not to push. The mob's decision to stand down preserved long-term authority, but it also acknowledged a boundary that had not existed before. Harlem's leadership understood this shift without needing confirmation. Stability was maintained. No attempt was made to capitalize publicly on the moment. Public victories provoke retaliation. Quiet endurance preserves leverage. The streets internalized the lesson. Respect for power remained, but it was no longer unconditional. Authority could be challenged indirectly. Influence could be defended without confrontation. That understanding reshaped future encounters across the city. What made this moment significant was not its visibility, but its permanence. Once boundaries are acknowledged, they do not disappear. They become reference points. Reference points guide behavior long after the moment itself has passed. The underworld thrives on memory. Memory shapes reputation. Reputation determines risk. This confrontation entered that memory quietly, altering how power calculated its moves. Harlem did not become untouchable. No territory ever is. But it became measured differently. Intimidation would no longer be applied casually. The cost had been demonstrated. This adjustment extended beyond one organization. It influenced how dominance was asserted across New York. Guns remained tools, but no longer guarantees. Restraint gained value. The mob boss, who chose to stand down, did not lose authority. He preserved it by avoiding exposure. But in doing so, he confirmed something essential. Power has limits, and those limits can be reached without violence. The underworld had rewritten a rule without admitting it. And once rewritten, that rule could not be undone. What remained unseen was how this quiet recalibration would shape the next generation of power struggles where restraint, not firepower, would determine who truly controlled the future. History rarely records restraint. It documents conflict, not the moments when violence is avoided. Yet the most influential shifts often occur in those silent spaces. This confrontation ended without bloodshed, but its legacy endured far longer than any violent victory could have. The city returned to routine. Streets moved. Businesses operated. Life continued. On the surface, nothing appeared different, but beneath that rhythm, awareness lingered. Power had been tested, not through confrontation, but through endurance. The man at the center of Harlem's response did not seek recognition. Recognition would have reduced the moment to ego. Silence allowed it to remain structural. Structural changes last longer than personal victories. The mob continued operating. Its reach remained vast, its authority intact, but its certainty had adjusted. Harlem had introduced a variable that could not be ignored. Future encounters reflected that adjustment. Pressure was applied more selectively. Negotiation replaced intimidation sooner. Force became a last resort, rather than a first response. The underworld had adapted. This moment never appeared in official histories. There were no documents recording the standoff, no acknowledgement of recalibration. Yet within the networks that mattered, its meaning was understood. Harlem had demonstrated that power does not always need to confront authority to redefine it. Sometimes, refusing to react is enough. Endurance reshapes environments more effectively than escalation. The mob boss's decision to stand down preserved his empire, but it also confirmed a limit. That confirmation altered how dominance functioned across the city. Authority was no longer assumed to be absolute everywhere. The legacy of this standoff lived on in behavior, in caution, in patience, in the quiet understanding that intimidation is only effective when it is believed. Once belief shifts, power must adapt. Harlem did not claim victory. It did not need to. The outcome spoke for itself. The guns had arrived. They had failed to dictate terms. And when the moment demanded escalation, restraint prevailed. This was not a story of defeat or triumph. It was a story of recalibration, of how power evolves when faced with resistance. It cannot easily crush. The city absorbed the lesson quietly, and long after the confrontation faded from memory, its influence remained embedded in how authority moved, how pressure was applied, and how silence continued to hold weight. Some victories are never announced. They do not end with applause or headlines. They end with adjustment. This was one of those victories.